And I'm Shahid Naeem. I'm a professor of ecology in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology, a department I chair at Columbia University. And today's class is going to ask the question, does extinction matter? And we're going to go into it in some depth because we're not just going to ask whether or not extinction matters in terms of the loss of species we know and love, like tigers and bears and so forth, but we're going to ask, are there environmental consequences to extinction? Okay. And now, the best place to start is to start in what I'm going to call the beginning, but I'm going to take the beginning from a sociocultural perspective, and I'm going to go back to Genesis. And in Genesis, there's this interesting passage that says, out of the ground, the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to the man. The man was Adam, to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. I find it remarkable that in Genesis, at the very beginning, the first command that was given Adam, which is shown here on the right in this one of these illustrated manuscripts and early Christian texts, was to understand and study the diversity of life in his world. His world and her world was Eden. And Eden was a place which was rich in biodiversity. Lots of fish, lots of plants, lots of mammals, lots of reptiles, although we can only see a snake here. And there were a very, very nice environment. The environment was so nice that Adam and Eve didn't have to wear any clothes. But the problem is, they were given a temptation and told not to eat fruit of the tree of knowledge. And it's a temptation they couldn't resist, as the story goes. And when they did that, they were thrown out of Eden. And in this wonderful book by Carolyn Merchant called Reinventing Eden, she talks about the fall, that when we left Eden, we suddenly discovered a world that was a disorderly wilderness in which animals, who once lived in harmony, now devour one another. And Adam and Eve could no longer live outside. They had to find shelters, live in caves, wear some kind of clothing in most of the places where they lived in the world. This was the new world. And we all want to recover Eden, and we all have a sense that Eden, if we want to get back there, is a place that has to be biologically rich and will have a really nice climate. And that, to me, is the focus of today's class. And I want to share with you, I think, what biodiversity is. And I think the best way to do that is to show you, starting in 1986, share with you some of the pictures that I and my spouse have taken. These are us when we were graduate students studying biodiversity in the Costa Rican rainforest. And we've been taking pictures ever since. And what we'll notice, which I think you'll notice if you go outside and take a walk in a park or go to a garden or just watch Animal Planet or read National Geographic, that the world is filled with biodiversity. And there are three things to note about biodiversity. One is that species vary in their morphology, in their color, in their behavior. And that species, the second thing to note is that species are found everywhere. They're found in arid environments, wet environments, salty environments, freshwater environments. They're found in the ice of the Antarctic and the Arctic, and they're found in the sands of the hot regions of the world. So biodiversity is found in every kind of habitat, and there are lots of different kinds of habitats. But the third thing to know is less easy to see, and that's the fact that all of these species affect their environment. They modify the vegetation. They feed on one another. They facilitate one another if they're pollinators. They change the world around them, and we do the same. Life actually modifies life, and this will become important later on when we talk about the third aspect, which is often forgotten about biodiversity, that life influences the environment around us. And if we can remember all three of these different components about biodiversity, I think we'll take a different view about what extinction actually means to us, rather than just focusing on the loss, the tragic cultural and social loss of losing the species that mean so much to us because they're charismatic and we have a great fondness for them. Because when we look at species, I think we see ourselves. We see the kinship that we have in the 4 billion year evolutionary history that we all share. They are our cousins, our uncles, they are our brothers and sisters, and that kinship, I think, is just amazing and something that's really heartwarming to think about. So that when we're losing biodiversity, we're actually losing a part of us. We're actually losing a part of the world that has been with us since the very, very beginning. Okay, so now if we take a look at world from these three perspectives, you'll see that the way we address this question involves tackling those three different things, and then not the cultural and social aspects. Yes, I know, when we see a mother elephant taking care of her baby elephant, it resonates with us, but there's more to biodiversity than just that. So this brings us to the question, does biodiversity matter? And it's a complicated question, and to tackle it, we're going to break down this class in 5 different sections with a big question at the end. So this is the roadmap at the top. The first part, we're going to talk about origination and extinction. Second part, we'll talk about how life governs local and global environmental conditions. In the third part, we'll talk about the current state of biodiversity. In the fourth part, we'll talk about recent scientific research. And in the fifth part, we'll talk about what can and is being done to stop extinction. The sixth part is actually a question for all of us to ponder. Can we prevent a possible global collapse of Earth's environment if extinction is allowed to go unchecked? So let's start moving through this. And once again, where's the best place to begin? I'm going to argue at the beginning, origination and extinction. So if we were to retell the tale of creation from the scientific perspective, we would say that about 14 billion years ago, that we started out with a very small space that was pretty much an unstructured, amorphous plasma of subatomic particles, which are all really weird and funky. But what happened was that tiny little point started to expand. And when it expanded, we then started to have the appearance of structure in our universe. What was expanding was this collection of subatomic particles, some of which you're probably familiar with. They're the 12 fermions, which you can divide into the quarks and into the leptons. These might be strange to you, but you might recognize the electron, for example, which is a lepton. We know that that is the particle that is very important to electricity. The photon is a boson over there, that green one, and it actually is what's responsible for light, like the light we see. Some of you may have heard of the Higgs boson, which is called the God particle because it imparts mass onto matter. But all of these things actually were in the plasma, beginning to take shape and beginning to be mixed and matched and combined in different ways, just like you would go to the shelf in your cupboards or your refrigerator and take down different ingredients and combine them. If you combine them to make hadrons, you get 2 types of hadrons, which are called mesons and baryons. And the baryons are actually just 2 sets of 3 quarks. If you have 2 up quarks and 1 down quark, you combine them together, you get a proton. If you take 1 up quark and 2 down quarks, you get a neutron. And if you combine protons and neutrons together with electrons, you get elements. 1 proton, 1 neutron, 1 electron, you have hydrogen. 2 protons, 2 neutrons, 2 electrons, you get helium. I'm sure you know the routine. Probably this is raising your stress level if you've had chemistry some time ago. I know I found chemistry very stressful, but as you go through this process, you'll eventually get larger and larger atoms, larger and larger nuclei. It's called nucleosynthesis. So you get lithium, eventually carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and then the heavy elements like gold and mercury. And the heaviest, that at least occurs naturally on Earth, is uranium. It's not a very stable element, but it's there. And this chemistry is often forgotten because it is this material, these elements, that were in the dust clouds surrounding our sun about 5 billion years ago, that when it ignited, it blew away a lot of the dust, but within that dust ring, within that ring around the sun, there were aggregates of particles that had aggregated into larger particles, which had aggregated into planetesimals and had formed the rocky planets, as we call them. That would be Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. Then the planets which were further away from the sun are the gas giants like Neptune and Jupiter and Saturn and Planet 9, which you may have heard about. We haven't seen it, but we know it's out there. And this actually is our birthplace. And it's important because if you go back and look at life in that particular time, this is what it looked like 4 billion years ago, at least an artist's impression. This is the Hadean, and in this particular time, there was no oxygen. The atmosphere had a lot of methane, so imagine the sky was orange, not blue. The moon was very, very close, having recently formed from the Earth, and it has been moving away from the Earth little by little every single year. At the end of this year, it will move a little bit further away, and so now it's just a small ball in the sky at night. But it also was a time when there was an incredible number of impacts from meteorites and asteroids and comets, which brought lots of material, including water, to the Earth. And this actually, believe it or not, is the birthplace of life. And the reason I like this is because I think contrast that to Eden. You might say this is not Eden. This is probably a sort of live presentation or an actual sort of manifestation of hell. Right? It was really just an incredibly horrible place. But it actually turns out to be, from a biological perspective, the perfect place for life to form because it was chemically really rich and dynamic, and we had trillions and trillions of these little tiny microscopic bubbles forming here and there. And at some point, one of those bubbles accumulated enough stuff that it was able to have these components which are essential to all living things. It had a genome made up of nucleic acids. It had a membrane made up of lipids, phospholipids. It was able to take in nutrients and build proteins and govern the chemistry of the cell and produce waste and package them up and get them out of the cell. And that was the first cell. And it's amazing. I just think, wow, I would love to see what that first cell looked like. But I think what's even more interesting is that cell now had the capacity to accumulate matter, to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So eventually it would have to divide in two, because it's a fragile little thing, right? And then those would then get bigger and bigger and divide again. And you go to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16. You'd get this sort of geometric growth. And eventually the world would be filled with this particular cell. But something really bizarre happened. For whatever reason, mutation, other sorts of changes, the genome would change. And when it changed, the cell would change. And some of those cells, maybe most of those cells, actually the change was not for the better, but sometimes the change was for the better, and then we'd have a new cell. What we would have is origination. We have the origination of new forms of life. And you might ask yourself, and I often do, why is it that life began to diversify? Because with origination, you get diversification. And this beautiful picture, which I think is aesthetically quite appealing, it's not scientifically the most accurate, but it actually shows that what happens at the bottom there in the center is that that one cell began to change. It didn't just make more and more of itself, it began to make new copies of itself, which differed ever so slightly. And there are many species of bacteria, many species of archaea, and eventually we have what are called the eukaryotes, and tremendous diversification, all the way up to the modern age where there are many kinds of species we're familiar with, especially the vertebrates, the fish, the mammals, the reptiles, the amphibians, and so forth. But there were also many species in the past, and some of them underwent mass extinction. We don't see trilobites anymore, we don't see ammonites anymore, and we don't see the non-avian dinosaurs, right? There were times when extinction took its toll, and we call those mass extinctions. But here's the point to remember, and this I think is totally amazing. Origination always outpaced extinction. Origination occurs, so does extinction, but origination always producing more species than they were disappearing. Origination is a rare event, right? But extinction is a rare event too, except that every now and then it occurs in these terrible mass extinctions. But by and large, even after a mass extinction, about 10 million years later, that machine of originating new species would mean that it would override the loss from a mass extinction. Origination always outpaces extinction. And this is an important lesson to get from looking at the patterns of biodiversity, which have been put together by many, many evolutionary biologists to look at 4 billion years of the origin of all of the species, ourselves included. So this brings us to part 2. Life governs local and global environmental conditions. This was the thing that I said that I think people sometimes don't appreciate. We appreciate the evolutionary history. We appreciate the diversity of form and function, behavior, color, and so forth. We don't appreciate how important life is to the environment. And the reason that is because we don't have this rather unromantic view of life, unless you take biology classes. And that is, we forget sometimes that we are chemical systems in disequilibrium. We are made up of those elements that were combinations of those baryons, making up hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and others. We have lots of elements in us, the heaviest one being iodine, right? But by and large, if you look at plants, if you look at microorganisms, you look at animals, they're always basically, and again, it's not very romantic, but they're basically chemical system. And they're in disequilibrium because they're not static, they're all growing. They're all taking more elements and building more compounds. They're a disequilibrial state of chemistry. And that means that they are taking elements out of their environment and they're putting elements in that environment as well. And you're doing that right now. You are exhaling carbon dioxide and contributing carbon dioxide. And if you're having some food right now, you're taking in elements and building yourself. And if you have time to go and deposit waste, you'll be doing the converse of that, right? We are chemical systems. We just tend not to think so much about that. But when you do, you come up with this really remarkable story, right? Let's do a back of the envelope calculation to figure out how much life there is on Earth. Now we know that the surface of the Earth is about 500 million kilometers square. And we also know that the total biomass of Earth, which is measured in carbon, we tend not to measure all of the elements, we just measure carbon because that's the most important one, comes out to roughly 1 trillion tons of carbon. Okay? So then just do the division and you ask how much in the way of biological carbon is there per kilometer square? And you get roughly about 2,000 tons of carbon. Now, carbon by itself isn't interesting, right? We want to get proteins, carbohydrates, we want to get lipids, we want to get all of those complex compounds. And if you do that, what you actually wind up getting, you translate the 2,000 tons of carbon, biological carbon, into biomass, you get about half a pound of biomass per square foot. So imagine a square foot in front of you, not terribly big, and then imagine a half a pound of biomass. Okay, how do you imagine that? I always think of peanut butter, because peanut butter consists of carbohydrates and fats and proteins, and is kind of this gooey, non-living, at least we hope not, biomass. And so what it means is to take a sort of square foot of bread, a very thin slice of bread, and then smear on it about a half a pound of biomass, and now cover the whole Earth in peanut butter like that. It's an extremely thin layer. And that raises the question, which might surprise you, is that how can such a puny amount of life matter? It sounds impressive, 1 trillion tons of carbon, but actually it's not a lot given how big Earth is. And this was the question that James Lovelock was obsessed with. He was asked, as an atmospheric chemist, could we actually tell whether Mars has life on it? This is something we've been curious about since the 1960s and 70s when we first started to go out in space and see if we could fly past Mars and see what was going on. And they said, can we tell if there's life on Mars from far away? Because we didn't have the technology we have today. Because even as we speak, there's a rover up there on Mars and there's a little helicopter flying around still trying to answer that question, is there life on Mars? But he is an atmospheric chemist and he said, here's how I'm going to answer that question. Let's take a look at Venus and look at how much carbon dioxide, nitrogen, oxygen is in its atmosphere. And let's look at the temperature and what the atmospheric pressure would be. And he said for Venus, it's mostly carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, very little nitrogen, almost no oxygen whatsoever. And the temperature is flat 500 degrees, or 5 times the boiling point of water, 500 degrees Celsius roughly. And all that gas sitting on your head means there's 90 times as much atmospheric pressure as there is on Earth today. He said, now let's take a look at Mars. Mostly carbon dioxide, very little nitrogen, very little oxygen. It's a lot colder, it's further away from the sun, and the atmospheric pressure is very light because there's very little gas sitting on top of your head, so it's less than what it is on Earth. He said, now let's take a look at Earth, and let's remove all of the biological process. There's no living thing on Earth anymore, and say, what is the atmospheric chemistry of an abiotic Earth? And you know what? Mostly carbon dioxide, very little nitrogen, very little oxygen, surface temperature about 300 degrees, or 3 times the boiling point of water, and an atmospheric pressure that's 60 times what it is today, right? If you contrast that to the biotic Earth, the only difference between these two models is that one has life in it, the biotic Earth, and the other doesn't. And he said, oh my gosh. Life, in spite of what seems to be a puny amount of it, actually has the capacity to totally transform our planet. We argue that life begets life. Life actually transforms the planet so that it's actually conducive to life. And it's been doing this progressively over 4 billion years. And he formulated the Gaia hypothesis. Interesting hypothesis, but we won't take time to go through it today, but I think you sort of get the point. Life begets life. And I love this picture because it reminds me of many walks I've had and walks you've probably had at night. When you look up at the sky, if it's clear, and you see all these stars, and you see that beautiful cloud of dust in the Milky Way. But as an ecologist, what I see is hell, because out there is the frigid, radioactive vacuum that's just outside of our atmosphere. And underneath that force field, which is a thing of science fiction, right? Force fields, but we have a real force field, is life. And we actually keep the surface of the planet one that is conducive of life. Life begets life. And so you think about all the plants and the animals that are in this field, And you think about all the microbes that are living in the soil or living on the organisms, and they are going through their chemical disequilibria and transforming the world into one that is habitable. And you can see this. This is from the space station. There is the atmosphere. That atmosphere is our force field, and it protects us from the frigid, radioactive vacuum of space. You step outside of that, boom, you're gone. I mean, basically, we are waiting almost, in anticipation of what could happen as the vacuum of space crushes in on us. But it doesn't happen. It hasn't happened for 4 billion years, and hopefully it'll never happen in our lifetime. But it could happen. That's the thing, is that if you actually get rid of life or you modify life, we could go to an atmosphere that's somewhere between Venus and Mars, right? None of which is actually very good in terms of an option. Okay, so that brings us to the third stage. Now that we've seen that the diversity of life is incredibly ancient, 4 billion years. It's incredibly diverse, and that you find it in every single habitat on the face of the planet. We now want to say, well, what is the state of biodiversity? And I think that's an important thing to think about. And a lot of people sort of wonder, how do we know how much biodiversity is out there? Okay, there's a lot, but how do we know? And we do it exactly the same as astronomers. Astronomers will tell you how many stars there are, how many galaxies there are. They have sort of scientific ways of coming to those estimates, and they have a lot of confidence in those estimates. And we do as well for biodiversity. This is my favorite estimate. There are lots of other ways to try to derive how many species there are out there. But what someone is doing here, what Maura and colleagues have done, is they said, let's take a look at all of the different taxonomic classes in the hierarchy here. We have the phylum at the top, and within the phylum, or within a phylum are classes. Within a class, there are orders. Within orders, there are families. Within families, there are genera. Within genera, there are species. And let's look at all of discoveries since 1750, because that's when we started publishing these things, at least in Western science. And what is discovered is that somewhere around 1950 or so, there were no more phyla. We found them all. Right? It seems if you found a new phylum, rush and call the newspapers because you will get on the front page. It would be an amazing thing to find another phylum. People are looking, but there don't seem to be any more. If you look at classes, it seems like there still are some classes to be found, but we found most of them. If you look at orders, there are a few more orders to be found. If you look at families, you get the picture, there's a few more. If you look at genera, there's a few more to be found. But if you look at species, we have no idea. Because the curve, which is that little thin black line, it doesn't really show any sign of sort of leveling off or showing an acidosis. We don't really know how many there are. But here's the genius of this paper. They said, if you actually look at the number of genera inside families, if you look at the number of families inside orders, number of orders in classes, the numbers of classes in phyla, plural phylum, it actually constitutes a straight line if you plot the taxonomic level against the log of the abundance of each of those. And that means that however many species there are, they must be at the end of that line. What's the end of that line? 8.7 million species. I love it. There are 8.7 million species. That's a lot, right? There might even be more, because people say that more at all. You didn't realize that, of course, way back in 1750, nobody was describing the species or microorganisms. We're still in the process of doing that. And there might actually be a lot more diversity than we think, but at least a conservative estimate is that there are millions of species that are out there. Okay, what's happening to them? They are declining everywhere. Everybody waits for the World Wildlife Fund to put out its Living Planet report, as it calls it. And what this report does is it tells us the state of the populations of vertebrates. Vertebrates are the fish, the mammals, the birds, the amphibians, the reptiles, and so forth. And the reason they focus on that, because those are the groups of species we have the best data for. We don't have very good data about the mollusks. We don't have very good data about the insects. We don't have even very good data about the plants, but we have really good data about the vertebrates. So let's follow them and assume that most of life is actually following the same trajectory. And as you can see from this map, whether you're looking at North America, South America, Africa, Eurasia, or Southeast Asia, including Australia and New Zealand, everywhere you look, ever since they started collecting the data in the 1970s, it's been going down and down and down. There's a few blips up in here and there, but basically the trend is downward. And it doesn't seem like it's being affected by anything that we're doing in terms of conservation. It's just going down. We are living in a world where biotic impoverishment or decline in biological diversity is occurring both at global scales and at local scales. Another way to look at it is at this map, and they plot in red places where biodiversity has been lost because we've modified the habitat. Urban environments, pollution, agriculture, grazing lands, things like that. And the green areas are where we haven't changed the land too much. And you'll notice that the green areas are in the north where it's cold and dark for a large part of the year, so we haven't changed that too much. And then the arid regions, the Sahara Desert over here, the top of Africa, the Gobi Desert in Asia. And then if we look at the arid interior of Australia, we haven't modified these habitats too much. Interestingly, even the tropical systems, which are the most diverse, are beginning to show their loss of biodiversity. Now in the Amazon, there's still a lot of diversity there, but you can see that it's beginning to become fragmented, it's beginning to become red. Our world is one of declining biological diversity and biotic impoverishment. So this leads to something that I think many of you have heard about. It's the sixth mass extinction, or the Anthropocene within which we live, which features this mass extinction. So what is the Anthropocene? Well, if you look at the last geological period, which was called the Holocene, you would see that sea level rose and then it remained constant for thousands of years. Global temperature rose and then it remained constant for thousands of years. Atmospheric CO2 rose and it remained constant for thousands of years. And then the amount of land we lost through storms, volcanoes, tsunamis, and so forth was very little compared to the whole Earth, and it remained constant over many, many years. And then in the bottom graph, you can see human populations started to grow and started to grow really, really rapidly in recent history. So much so that you can see that the changes that we have created by our growth are actually showing up in really marked ways. If you look at sea level, it's going up dramatically. If you look at global temperatures, going up dramatically. If you look at atmospheric CO2, it's going up dramatically, and so forth. This is a new era. It's very, very different from the Holocene, and people have proposed to call it the Anthropocene. In fact, I think most people have accepted that it's the Anthropocene, when in fact it's not official yet. We still have to wait for this group of geologists who will actually officially designate it the Anthropocene, but even now the term is in common use. This is our age. This is the age of humanity. And the thing to me that's really significant about it is that if you look at the background rate of extinction, which is, remember, is very, very low. Extinction is very, very rare. And it's always outpaced by origination. That the background rate of extinction, which is very, very low, if again we look at the vertebrates for which we have the best data, that now extinction is well above that. In some cases 100 times higher, in some cases 1,000 times higher. And people have tried to look at other organisms for which there are data, but any way you look at it, the background rate of extinction is really low. The current rate of extinction is extremely high. And that's why people are saying we're in the sixth mass extinction, because within 100 years or so, we will have reached 75%, 3/4 of the species will have gone extinct. And that means we will qualify to be a mass extinction. A mass extinction is typically defined as a loss of 3/4 of the species. And so we're living in this particular period. And so if we were asked, what is the Anthropocene's most notable feature, I would say that at a global scale and at a local scale, biodiversity has declined. Biotic impoverishment is everywhere. There are fewer species, fewer genes, fewer populations, fewer taxa, fewer trophic levels, fewer biotic interactions. A lot of predators are gone. A lot of pollinators are gone. There's more and more biotic impoverishment. And then what I would argue is if you would look at this most notable feature and say, well, what do we make of it? I would argue that of all of the Anthropocene changes, and the big ones are emerging diseases like the pandemic we're currently living in, pollution, mass extinction, invasive species. These are the big ones, right? And that I would say that mass extinction is the one that should concern us the most. You might say, well, why? Why would I say that? I think you'll agree with me. We could talk about this later. But I would say it's because it's the only change that is not reversible. It is irreversible. I think if we wanted to, we could stop climate change. We could control invasive species. We could take better care of diseases and managing them when they emerge, or we could even prevent them from emerging. And we can take care of pollution as we did with the Clean Air and the Clean Water Act and how we patched up the hole in the ozone, right? By changing our refrigerants. We can do amazing things if we set our mind to it. But if we lose 75% of the species, and we've probably already lost many of them, we cannot bring them back, except for some of the fantasies of Jurassic Park or some of the people who believe in de-extinction. We might be able to genetically engineer those species and maybe bring them back. But if most of them disappeared, we don't even have the DNA. And it's irreversible. It's the toughest environmental problem we face. I don't think it actually gets the kind of attention that pollution, climate change, and emerging disease gets. Okay, So where's the research? I would like to say we live in an age where scientific evidence is actually what's the most important when we decide what we're going to do about tackling environmental problems. Not everybody feels that's true, but I think most of us, and actually there was a survey actually that was done to show that most Americans actually do believe that science is the foundation for the way we should lead our lives and the way we should understand the world around us. So, you have a few vocal people who make a lot of noise and say science is important, but I believe, I am a scientist, I'm biased, that scientific research is really important to make these claims. Okay, it's a very complicated field. It's been going on for 30 years. It started in 1992. I did one of the first experiments myself in 1994. There are thousands, literally thousands of papers have been published on that. How can we summarize what's going on? And I think what's really beautiful about this is that the experiments themselves at their foundation are actually quite elegant and easy to do. You could do this at home in your garden or in an aquarium. You can do this research if you wanted to. The idea is take a bunch of species, and each species here is represented abstractly by a little square of different color. The top ones are predators, then we have some herbivores, then we have some plants, and then we have some decomposers in the soil and the sediment and so forth. Lots of species. And we keep track of what they're doing. Remember I said that they're chemical disequilibria. They are taking inorganic carbon, they're taking inorganic nitrogen, and they're making proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and nucleic acids, organic compounds, organic carbon, organic nitrogen, and then they're recycling. And this is what an ecosystem does. Well, put a cap on that thing, attach a meter to it, and measure stuff that's important to you. I might be interested in how much carbon is being sequestered. I might be interested in how much nitrogen is in the soil because that determines the soil's fertility. I might be interested in how much protein there is because people are interested in eating some of it if it's a farm, right? We just have a book coming out on agroecology, which talks about these sorts of issues. And this meter would measure that. We know that when there's lots of diversity, the current state of the world, that meter would be in the green. We're going to call that the green zone. And if you changed something in that box, it could go to the left, it could go to the right, and at some point it could go into the red zone. So what do? This is what the researchers did. It's so elegant, right? They just took some species out. They said, now we have a biotically impoverished world. And they said, okay, let's try it again. This time, watch the meter, take out these species. Watch the meter, take out these species. Do this over and over again. One of the experiments I had that we did in China had 700 different combinations of species going from very simple communities to very complex communities. This would be a simple community, not very many species there, right? And that would be way on the sort of low end of biodiversity. And do what scientists do, write down what you saw on the meter every time you did this experiment, and then consider what would happen if you got rid of all of the biodiversity so you can understand what the low point is, and put it on a graph. Scientists love graphs. Put biodiversity on the x-axis on the bottom, put the ecosystem function, the process that you're interested in, on the y-axis. Write down or plot on that graph each of the measurements you saw on the meter, and then you get this particular image. You get a curve, you get a collection of points that can be translated into the following. The best fit in terms of the properties of this distribution is this asymptotic line. And what it tells you is that if you add a small amount of biodiversity to a place where there is none, you get a dramatic rise and change as we go from the left to the right. And then things become stable. And you can add more and more species and things will become more and more stable because if you lose them, it won't matter so much. There's redundancy there. But that is what we find in the thousands of experiments that we've seen. There's some variability and there's some arguments about the mechanisms that underpin this, but that's basically, and you could join the scientific venture by doing these experiments yourself, right? It's really cool, I think, even though it's complicated to analyze it statistically or mathematically, but it's very elegant. Now we can do things like we can try to shift the curve. We can add water, add biocides, add fertilizer, get rid of all those species that would do those things for us for free, and we could produce a farm. And we might be able to produce more of what it is we want, like food, more protein, more carbohydrates, things we want to eat. But then it becomes unstable because we have to take care of it. And if you don't irrigate, if you don't use biocides, and there's an outbreak of insects, and you don't use fertilizer, and the soil becomes depleted, you won't get the productivity that you want. The converse, in terms of managing an ecosystem, is to actually just remove species without paying attention to what you're doing. Just fish out all the fish from the sea, hunt all of the organisms out of the forest without any kind of regulation. You could degrade the land, you could mine, you could farm until the land is no longer productive, and then you would abandon it. And that would be degrading the land. And so we have these options, manage to get what it is we want, but then we become the caretakers. It's very unstable, or just allow things to degrade, in which case we will lose eventually the functioning that we really need. So in 2012, it had been 20 years since this field started in 1992, and we were invited to write a paper and say, it's a review paper saying, what have we learned? And it's a long paper, and if any of you would like to see it, I'll be happy to send you a copy of it. But you can see that we had a chance to do a diagram, an illustration that covers those 3 points that we made when we looked at all of those pictures of animals and plants in the world around us. And the 3 things are that all life is connected by one evolutionary history, and that life is distributed over the planet by what we call environmental filters. Those that are adapted to dry environments live in the dry environments. Those that are adapted to marine systems live in marine systems. Those that are adapted to freshwater systems live there. They're environmental filters. But what's important to note is that in every one of these ecosystems all around the world, except in the cold, dark north and Antarctic, the Arctic and the Antarctic and south, if you actually look at the deserts where there aren't very many people, there may not be much change, but everywhere else there is massive change. Something like 3/4 of the world is undergoing this change by people. We're making the world one that can produce more food or give us the things we want to make our lives better. So it's completely understandable. But sometimes we forget that what we're doing is we are changing the way nature actually influences the environment, because it's invisible. And that's what I was saying. This is the third aspect of biodiversity that a lot of people don't actually pay much attention to or are not aware of. The nitrogen in the atmosphere, the oxygen in the atmosphere, the methane in the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide, that force field that is protecting us from the frigid radioactive vacuum of nature is being challenged by the fact that biodiversity is changing, just like those experiments that we showed you. Biodiversity is declining both globally and locally, and that could really have quite severe disasters. I wanted to show you one of the experiments. I was involved in this experiment back when I was a professor at the University of Minnesota. We published a bunch of papers from these studies. This is the biggest biodiversity experiment. The one in China, people will say that's even bigger, but it doesn't have as many species as we have here. That had 700 plots. I think this is something like 300 plots. And you can see, I think you sort of see if you squint, that there are places where we took away all of the biodiversity. There's some places where there's lots of plant species, maybe as many as 25, some cases 30. There's some places where there's just one species. They're monocultures. Some places where there's 2, 4, 8, 16. We did exactly what I showed you before. Lots of different combinations of biodiversity, from biologically rich communities to biologically poor communities. And you can see we get that asymptotic curve, right? That a small number of species makes a huge difference. And after a while, if you add more species, what you get is a more stable system, but you don't change the functioning as much. And if we look at this curve here, we're looking at the fertility of the soil. How much nitrogen is the soil? You find that when there's nothing there, there's a lot of nitrogen in the soil. You add plants, it starts to produce biomass, more biomass, more biomass, less nitrogen in the soil. And then eventually you get things to sort of level off. And now we have a lot of biomass in which the nitrogen has been relocated from the soil into the vegetation. Beautiful experiment. What I like about this is you can see this from the space station. Isn't that cool? It's such a big experiment. I would love to go through a lot of these studies, especially the studies that are done in my lab. These are my students and my colleagues. We work in the Arctic, we work in the tropics, we work in wetlands, we work in the soils of Africa, we work on agricultural systems. Lots of papers, lots of statistics, lots of nasty equations. But any way you look at it, what we've discovered, and we've had a lot of fun doing this, is what I've just told you, is that basically all of these studies are showing that biodiversity matters, and it matters to the way systems function. And that small numbers of species make a huge difference to the world, and lots of species make that world stable. Okay, so the science is there. You can summarize these 3 points. If you lose biodiversity, ecosystems become less efficient. If you lose biodiversity, you will find that their functioning declines. And if you lose biodiversity, you will find that they become less stable. Right? These are the take-home messages from those thousands of experiments. So this brings us to 5. Well, given the science and given what we know, given all those experiments and some 30 years of research on this topic, what can and is being done to stop extinction? I'm going to take an approach where we're going to look at the global level because I think solving the problem requires global coordination. And I love the Brundtland report, which was written by Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland of Norway. In 1987, she wrote for the United Nations this report called Our Common Future. And it might seem odd to think about this because it seems common sense today, but what they said is the way we had been developing up to the 1980s was no longer an option because we were destroying our environment. And if we destroy our environment, we can no longer develop in a way that would improve human well-being. We need a new paradigm for development, and it was called sustainable development. And that's the big deal these days, sustainable development, right? And so this was cool because later in 1992, which is when our field started, there was the UN Conference on Environment and Development held in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. A lot of things happened then, but the most important thing, I think, is that the UN Convention on Biological Diversity was one of the many things that was established back in 1992. I love it. All the countries of the world, except a few holdouts, and you might guess who they are, signed onto this agreement. World leaders agreed that if we want to achieve sustainable development, we really have to preserve biological diversity because biological diversity underpins the ecology of our natural world. And I thought, wow, a global agreement. This is fantastic. And I actually set off to do research on this topic because it seemed like people would really like to have the scientific foundation for this particular claim. And so then, fast forward to the year 2000, a new millennium, a new century, and the UN had this declaration, right, saying that we want to make sure in this millennium and we want to make sure in this century that we look to improving freedom, equality, solidarity, tolerance, and respect for people, and shared responsibility for economic development across the globe. And then they threw in there, and let's not forget, respect for nature. So the idea that nature was an important part of the world that we wanted was there in the Millennium Declaration saying, this is like, a New Year's resolution. We're going to do this. This century, this millennium. We're going to do things differently. It's all about sustainable development. Okay, so the United Nations set up the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, 1,300 researchers, including myself and many others, around the world. And it truly was around the world. We did this in all the different countries around. I had great fun traveling around the world. And we spent 5 years to come up with an assessment of the state of the planet and how we might look to the future. And this diagram on the right here is a summary of what the primary findings were. And that was that human well-being was entirely dependent on nature and the services that nature and ecosystems provide. And biodiversity was incredibly important to those ecosystems being able to function and provide us with the services we want and to make them stable. Now, human activity, which are called drivers, actually directly, indirectly, will affect the environment and will affect human well-being. So in a way, it's in our hands. We can take action to make the world a better place so that human well-being goes up. Sometimes we make mistakes, biodiversity goes down, ecosystems don't function as well, and then human well-being takes a hit. I love it, right? It was great. Okay, that was a major finding. And so the United Nations Millennium Development Goals were established. There were 8 goals, 18 targets, 47 indicators, things you could actually measure. And then I looked up and I said, great, we're going to eradicate poverty and hunger. We're going to achieve universal primary education. We're going to promote gender equality, all these fantastic social goals. But where's the environment? It's number 7, just number 7, ensure environmental sustainability. And when 2015 rolled around, people said, how well did we do? And they thought, well, we've reduced hunger a bit, we've reduced poverty a bit, we've improved health a bit, we've improved education a bit, but the environment really did not see any significant change in spite of this global commitment. Well, this is somewhat disheartening, but not to give up. The United Nations said, now we're going to have the new Sustainable Development Goals, and they're going to be completed in 2030. So that's about 10 years from now, right? This time we have 17 goals, right? And looking at them and saying, oh, great, end poverty, no more hunger, improve education and gender equality and stuff. But again, where's nature, right? Look for it. There are 2 of them, 14 and 15. You probably saw them. 14 says to take care of life below the water, and 15 says to take care of life on land. And if you actually break it down, There's 193 countries, a couple of holdouts, right? And then there are 17 goals, 169 targets, 230 indicators, much, much bigger than the Millennium Development Goals. But 90% of these goals and indicators are about social things, which are extraordinarily important. We need a world in which there's greater freedom, greater gender equity, greater education for all people. But you can't achieve any of that if the world falls apart and collapses under our feet because we didn't do anything for biodiversity. And that's what the science says. It's like, what's happening, folks? Right? Okay, let's go to Convention on Biological Diversity. Think like maybe there they got it right. And they set just one target in the year 2000. They said, give us 10 years and the world will significantly reduce the loss of biodiversity. We'll slow down the decline of biodiversity. We'll slow down the rise of biotic impoverishment. And what happened? 2010 rolled around. I can't imagine, when the executive secretary of the United Nations had to get up and say this, but they had to admit the target failed. But it did not actually reach its reduction at all. If anything, things seem to be getting a little worse, right? And so they said, just like in the Sustainable Development Goals, not to be deterred. They said, we're going to have 20 goals now. And in 2020, we're going to reach these 20 goals. 20 in 2020. I think they did it for the numerical alliteration. Well, 2020 rolled around last year, and here's the report card. If you look at the 20 goals, which are on the bottom there, the x-axis, and I'm not going to take the time to go into them, you can look up these different goals, and you look at the number of countries that achieve them. Solid greens mean they achieve them. Pale greens kind of getting there. Orange means really not a very good job. Red means you've failed utterly. Imagine this is a report card with 20 courses that you took, and these are your grades, right? Basically, you failed, maybe did a D, maybe did. In a couple of them, you might have done a C. This is me being the professor. But I would be terrified to bring this kind of report card home to my parents. Thank goodness I don't have to do that anymore, but this is a terrible report card about how we've done with biological diversity. Okay, so now we get to the last part of this, which is actually separate, sort of a question to ask you. Can we prevent a global collapse? Can we prevent ourselves from becoming somewhere between Venus and Mars, or something that is terribly horrible for life on Earth, ourselves included, if we, cannot stop extinction from going unchecked? And what I would say is that I think we can, but here's what has to happen. In the past, we were part of the natural world. We were there doing what all other animals do, doing what all plants do, microorganisms do. We were part of the living world, but then we separated from it. And when we separated from it, we then expected that our well-being to be served by nature. And we've restructured the world so that nature provides for us the services that make our lives better. And if you look at all the different frameworks, which are shown to the right, there's the one from the Millennium Assessment, second from the top, and you can see that human well-being is connected to biodiversity. But in this review paper, which I wrote with some others, we found that NGOs, other international agencies, many organizations keep coming up with this framework saying that we know, we get it. Biodiversity is really important to human well-being. Lots of different ways to look at it, but no matter how you look at it, whether it's a linear change or a bunch of boxes connected by arrows, or it's circular or it's radial, we know that biodiversity is really important. That's really quite exciting, I think, right? Can we turn things around, right? This is what we're asking, Well, here's what I'd say. The science is extensive and robust, right? And unequivocal. I'd say that that's the same for climate change, and we won't go there. We have many frameworks, as we just showed in the last figure, that all accurately lay out that humanity's dependence on biodiversity is unequivocal, right? And then we've shown that we have the capacity to establish global agreements, to set targets and goals, and to work towards meeting them. It's just that the environment really has always been kind of on the back burner, or a little bit too low in its profile in terms of all the other things we want to achieve. Even though we all recognize we cannot achieve any of those goals if the world collapses beneath our feet. And it will collapse. That's what the science says if we allow biodiversity to continue the way it's going. So I'm a scientist. I'm optimistic. I always believe that if you have the knowledge to hand, we can change things, right? So if we were to take all of these ideas we talked about today and put them into our international agreements and then reward those who give them gold stars if they meet the agreements, and get the rich countries to help the poor countries to be able to achieve these targets, set targets that are rational, achievable, and actually secure the functioning of ecosystems, and make biodiversity integral to all of the sustainable development goals, right? Development goals. I think, yes, we can do this if we establish new legislation which actually focuses on biodiversity. It is amazing, it's absolutely amazing to me that the Biden-Harris administration, to an executive order, has said we are now going to protect 30% of the US land and 30% of the US oceans by 2030. There's that numerical alliteration again, which is interesting because the Biden-Harris administration may be out in the next 4 years. They may be here for 8 years in total, but they'll definitely be out, 8 years from now. And we saw the difference between the previous administration and this new administration. I actually think that we need to make this a constitutional amendment. And that's an interesting thing to think about, because if we say that freedom, national security, and that well-being and the pursuit of happiness are in fact objectives of this country and this government, it should be in the Constitution that to achieve those, we need to protect biodiversity. And so we need to also revise our curricula. And that's why I love it that you folks are here sharing with me, our ideas and the knowledge that's been acquired in the last 30 years. But I think we need to talk about this in K through 12. So any of you are teachers, if you have children, find some way to bring these ideas to them and have it as part of all of the degrees, whether it's a law degree or a bachelor's degree or a degree of veterinary medicine or a PhD. Don't just let the ecologists and evolutionary biologists, let everybody learn about this and make biodiversity a mandatory part of education. So finally, I would say, yes, if we can raise the awareness of the significance of biodiversity loss, we can turn things around, right? So celebrate biodiversity. Today is actually Earth Day. It's 22nd of April. Go out, plant a tree, talk to people, take your kids to the zoo, go to the museum, watch the Animal Planet, really embrace biodiversity and see what a wonderful thing it is and talk about its significance to our environment. And celebrate the International Day of Biodiversity, which is often forgotten, which comes on the 22nd of May every year. So that's going to bring to a close what I wanted to present to you. So if you stay after, we'll have a question and answer period to talk about this. And thanks so much for joining the Day University in this particular class. I've had a great deal of fun doing this. Thanks a lot.